You're watching the Great Lakes Public Forum held in Toronto for the very first time. I'm Nam from TV Ontario. Joining me now, we've got Mark Fisher from the Council of the Great Lakes Region. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
I wanted to talk to you about the economic impact to the Great Lake water levels. Why are water levels important when we talk about the Great Lakes?
Well, I think it's obviously when you look at the Great Lakes, people see so much water. And the reality is that when you look at the challenges of climate change, we, over the last 10 or 15 years, are actually coming out of the lowest period of water levels that we've seen since record keeping in the early 1800s. So that's concerning for a lot of people because while natural fluctuations are a good thing, these low water periods can have some significant economic impact. So when you look at shipping, for example, you know, a laker that's carrying iron ore, 65,000 metric tons of iron ore normally, if it's 10,000 tons short of ore, that's equivalent to roughly 65,000 tons of steel production or 8,500 cars. You also need very precise water levels in terms of species breeding and what have you. So the fluctuations are a good thing, but when you see massive fluctuations on the high side or the low side, they can have significant impacts on the economy and the environment.
And I'm guessing it's probably difficult to predict the water levels. How do you do that?
Well, there's obviously a lot of monitoring that's in place across the system by both state, provincial governments and the two federal governments, as well as the International Joint Commission. And so there's a lot of data being collected, and that's certainly increasing our knowledge around how levels have responded, how they fluctuated over the last 100 years. And our climate change modeling is getting better in terms of predicting what things might look like in the future. But there's still a lot of uncertainty, a lot of variability, and the best way that we can manage levels right now is through organizations like the International Joint Commission, which controls a number of structures on Lake Ontario, Lake Superior that moderate levels and flows. And so as we get better at managing those regulatory plans, our hope is that we'll see much better capacity to see levels and flows that are good for shipping, good for the environment, good for cities who need to draw drinking water from the lakes. Just a regulatory system that is much more responsive to a diverse range of interests.
You mentioned shipping.
Yep.
Now, when the water levels are low, sometimes you raise it. But then when this happens, flooding to First Nation communities happens. How concerned is the council with this?
Well, I think when you look at those kind of issues across the system, they're certainly not new. They've been around since the Seaway was created in the late 50s. And I think, again, the work that the International Joint Commission is doing, the two countries are doing through how we regulate our control structures in the Great Lakes region and ensuring that there's more adaptability within those plans to address flows and make sure we don't get the extreme highs or the extreme lows. Is certainly one way that we can try to address those issues. We're not going to solve all of those problems, but having a regulatory approach that is more dynamic across the system will certainly help.
And what are the impacts to the economy when this happens?
Like I said before, when you look at shipping alone, it has a major impact in terms of the amount of goods that we can ship into and out of this region. And when you look at this region, it's a $5.8 trillion economy in US dollars. So the only two countries in the world that have greater economic activity than this region is China and the United States. It's a massive economic region. So when we don't get things right in terms of how we use our seaway and how ships move in and out, if we don't get things right in terms of how we protect our environment, it has an economic impact, it has an ecological impact.
Thank you for taking the time to speak with us, Mark.
My pleasure.